In previous conferences, we reflected on Sister Ramberta Westkemper, who sought and found God in nature, and Sister Celeste Camp, who found God in the hearts of prison inmates. My visit to the monasteries in Taiwan and Japan earlier this year left me eager to know more about our sisters who made so many personal sacrifices to find God on the other side of the world. I have been reading the letters of one sister in particular, Sister Francetta Vedder. I realize that some of you knew Sister Francetta personally. In fact, Sisters Sean and Glenore were present at her deathbed and attended her funeral in Tokyo in late December 1966. I know Sister Francetta only through her writings and other accounts of the mission to China. Some words that come to mind as I reflect on her letters are these: kind, compassionate, determined; humorous, flexible, determined; faithful, energetic, determined; humble, forgiving, determined. I will begin with a few biographical notes and a brief summary of the beginnings of our community's mission to China, and then read excerpts of Sister Francetta's letters from China. To provide more context, I encourage you to spend some time rereading either Sister Wiebra's booklet, Mission to China, or the chapter of With Lamps Burning entitled Foreign Missions.
Also, in Sister Bernard Marie's History of Taiwan, Beyond the Horizon, she includes some insights into the last months of the sisters in China. While she wrote the book in Chinese, she also publishes her English translation of it.
Frances Vedder was born on June 20th, 1896, in Sells, North Dakota. Her father died in 1905 when Frances was 9 years old. That may explain why her mother objected to her desire to enter religious life. Sister Francetta's personal file in our archives contains this handwritten note entitled Obstacles to My Entrance into the Convent. She writes, "I joined without my mother's consent. She threatened me by saying she would compel me to leave by law. This I knew she could not do, since I was 18 years old at the time. My former pastor also objected, but on seeing me so determined to carry out my intention, he gave me his blessing and consent. My mother, however, was not satisfied, and next threatened to disinherit me." Frances entered St. Benedict's Monastery in 1915 and did not receive a single letter from her mother for 5 years. She described her first home visit, which took place in 1920. "I so longed to see my mother, and yet I was afraid that on my arrival she'd refuse to speak to me. But prayers had wrought a change. She was only too glad to welcome me, and in fact we both wept for joy. On seeing how truly happy and contented I was, she realized it must have been God's holy will. Since then her prayer is ever that I may be faithful to my holy call." Sister Francetta served as a high school and college home economics teacher until 1929. On Saturday, August 24th of that year, a Benedictine priest arrived at St. Benedict's to ask a favor of Mother Louisa Walsh, a favor that would give a dramatic new direction to Sister Francetta's monastic life. The priest was Father Francis Cloherty, Chancellor of the Catholic University of Peking in China, which had been established by the Benedictine monks of the American Cantonese congregation at the request of the Vatican's Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. The Vatican and the monks were now eager to have Benedictine sisters at the university to teach women. Father Cloherty came to us, the largest community of Benedictine women, seeking volunteers for the proposed Women's College of the Catholic University of Peking. Because we were under diocesan jurisdiction at that time, Father Clorty also sought the support of Bishop Joseph Bush. Together, they managed to convince our chapter to vote in favor of this missionary venture. When Bishop Bush agreed to the China mission, it was with the stipulation that the St. Cloud Diocesan Office of the Propagation of the Faith would be responsible for securing funds for it. He did not want the monastery to be responsible for financing it because the sisters already had a $2 million debt from the construction of St. Cloud Hospital. But the expenses turned out to be much greater than anticipated. The Minnesota officials understood that the Catholic University would begin admitting women students, and the sisters would simply be hired as their teachers. The only financial obligation of the diocese would be to build a convent. When Mother Louisa asked for volunteers to go to China, more than 100 sisters signed up. From these, she chose 6. Sisters Donalda Terhar, Regia Zenz, Rachel Lulan, Ronane Gergen, Wibra Millenbein, and Francetta Vedder as superior. They left St. Benedict's on August 30th, 1930, 76 years ago. It seems appropriate to begin with Sister Francetta's struggle with homesickness, which she already suffered on the ship to China. September 1930, 1 month after arriving in Peking, she writes, "It seems as though we are so far, far away. I've only cried once very hard in our new home, so I'll be all right." But she continues speaking of St. Benedict's. "Please give the dear place a good look over for me. Several times we have wished ourselves back for at least a half a day." She says she brought along a little picture of the chapel, and often she kneels there in spirit at St. Joseph's altar and in her own choir stall, and then she concludes the letter, "You'll find me there every evening, the last pew or way up in front." Sometimes I feel that we are all alone in this world. In other letters she writes of creature discomforts. October 1930. "We have seen mice in broad daylight, dashing around unconcerned. They also have races between the roof and ceiling. Such a racket they do make." In March 1931 she writes about wiggly, wobbly, thousand-legged centipedes and says, "Maybe Sister Remberta could buy them from us for laboratory use." Then she notes there are fleas and a bed bug crawling on her scapular. Her letter of November 1930. "I have been sort of brave since my last letter to you, but last evening and this morning my courage has already failed me. This morning at Holy Communion and afterwards there was a regular flood, and I didn't dare let the sisters see me, so I just let the tears run, and my bench in front of me was all wet. And so it goes, darling Mother." Again in November 1930. "Your letter, dear Mother, brought you right here, and not to be able to see you and talk to you almost made me desperate. You told me to tell you everything. That I couldn't do, for there are no words to describe loneliness, and there is nothing for pains of homesickness. We all pray a great deal. Our chapel is our refuge, and we feel very strongly committed with each other and the dear Lord. The sisters are so kind to each other, and we are a real family of 6. We cherish our community room. How we wish you could be with us." The sisters arrived in Peking with lots of enthusiasm and a brave willingness to put up with physical discomforts for the sake of spreading the gospel. They made peace with the scorpions, salamanders, centipedes, and snakes that insisted on sharing their quarters. They became fond of their Christmas crèche, which consisted of a single figurine, the infant Jesus. They endured hot, humid summers, cold winters, and leaky roofs with relatively good cheer. Letters about making do. November 1930. The coif machine the sisters brought to China had been malfunctioning, and finally made one new coif for each sister. We wouldn't want you to see us in them, but they could be worse, and gradually I'm sure it will work. We have prayed so hard. On the pillows. The Benedictine priests at the university gave the sisters some cotton-stuffed pillows, which Francetta describes as regular little bricks. December 1932. Sister Rachel has typhoid fever with a temperature of 105, which frightens Sister Francetta. She writes, "I almost did weep out my heart and eyes last night, because everything seems so utterly hopeless. We have no money. The fathers have none. They are almost desperate. The whole situation is cruelty to human beings, and yet we gladly suffer it if it will mean help. It is truly God's work. I'm not so completely discouraged, though, and still like China." Perhaps the greatest hardship in their early years was being caught between the expectations of the Vatican and Catholic University of Peking officials on the one hand, and Mother Louisa and Bishop Bush on the other. In reality, the Benedictine priests and the apostolic delegate to China expected the sisters to found and fund a separate college for the women. For 5 years, the sisters on site in Peking struggled to establish a college with little or no financial support from the Catholic University and insufficient funds coming in from the United States. Misunderstandings, discouragement, and financial worries. August 1931. Sister Francetta had just received a letter from Bishop Joseph Bush in which he threatened to call the sisters back to Minnesota. She writes, "I just can't understand his change of attitude now when we need him so much." February 1932. The apostolic delegate insisted that the sisters begin accepting students, so they are expecting the first girls to arrive. The school and convent are in the same compound. May 1932. The sisters have been ordered out of their quarters so it can be used for a different religious community. They must be out in 3 months, so they have been house hunting. Sister Francetta writes that if they could get started and take in students, they could be earning for themselves. The Benedictines, quote, "feel ashamed when they ask us about our school, and always we must answer we do not know." The Benedictine priests had their own difficulties in keeping the university afloat, and in 1933, 3 years after our sisters arrived, they turned the operation over to another religious order. The sisters struggled to maintain a school in Peking for another 2 years.
With their letters home, the sisters sent photos of China, in particular of their sightseeing tours, through which they acquainted themselves with the life and culture of China.
May 1933. The Catholic University of Peking has been turned over to the SVD Fathers. The sisters are even more uncertain about their future. Japan has invaded parts of China and the threat of war continues. Sister Francetta takes the war in stride and is able to dwell on the beauty of spring, describing apple and peach blossoms, wisteria, lotus, and peonies. However, she recognizes that the sisters are under a lot of tension, and it is beginning to wear on them. She reports, "Yesterday I got a case of beer for them. 48 bottles for $4.25. Again in May 1933. We have been having a great deal of excitement. Planes carrying bombs hanging over the city. Many soldiers here from the southern provinces. Japanese soldiers also coming in to protect their legation here. The street has piles of sandbags for defense at each corner, and in between there are dugouts and trenches, machine guns, etc., and through it all we are not afraid." Several nights all the students slept on the floor of the sisters' community room so that we could all be closer together in case of sudden trouble. Every night I carry our cash and bank book to bed, because if looters would come, they would destroy whatever they could not carry with them. She notes that thousands of people have left the city.
When it became known that the Benedictine sisters would most likely have to leave China, the Vicar Apostolic of Kaifeng, Most Reverend Joseph Tacconi, hastened to invite the sisters to staff a middle school in his diocese.
By this time, Sister Francetta realized that St. Benedict's could not afford to fund the establishment of a women's college in Peking. She was happy to have an alternate plan because she and the other sisters were committed to staying in China.
Eager to accept this invitation, the sisters begged Mother Louisa and Bishop Bush to let them remain in China and work in this new field of Kaifeng. To this prayer, Bishop Bush would not listen. They petitioned a second time and a third time, and on April 8, 1935, he consented. The missionaries prepared to leave for Kaifeng in Honan province.
In September 1933, Sisters Francetta and Regia made a trip to Kaifeng. The bishop there was eager to have the Benedictine sisters. He offered to find a house for them, and they would take over an already established middle school.
By the time the sisters reached Kaifeng, the plans for their taking charge of the higher middle school had to be relinquished because of growing political unrest. Instead, a dispensary for the sick poor was opened. Here the sisters also instructed the children of the poor in religion. Thus, the 9,000 poor who were treated in the dispensary were brought into contact with Christianity.
Sister Ronaine has developed a cold, so she fairly hugged our little stove in the community room all day yesterday, and she is again at the same post today. She will not go to bed. She has the determination of a Sister Irma to stick it out, and in this case it means not giving in to breaking her record of never having been sick in bed a day in China.
So promising was this field that in 1936 Mother Louisa sent 2 more sisters to Kaifeng, Sister Ursuline Vanny to assist as teacher, and Sister Anelda Wall to assist in the dispensary.
Freed of the financial worries and the pressures of establishing a college, the sisters had renewed energy. They were finally getting settled into a stable mission.
St. Benedict's Convent agreed with the rich harvest of souls that was available to the sisters in China, and in August 1939 not only sent them additional help in the persons of Sister Flora Gable and Sister Vestina Burskin, but decided to erect a new and larger mission house. The old convent was to be turned into a dispensary and a school for poor children. The new building was to be used as the convent and a school for paying pupils. This work prospered, and in the school year ending in July 1941, the mission had instructed 224 children.
Just as they were on the road to stability, the Sino-Japanese War intensified. Kaifeng was occupied by Japanese soldiers. Sister Francetta reported that Nanking had been bombed and conditions were alarming. We talk war morning, noon, and night. Even in our dreams we are fleeing from the enemy. Yesterday the sirens sounded while Sisters Ursuline and I were out for some groceries. We surely made quick tracks for home to safety. By this time the sisters had received 3 notices from the American consulate to leave China. But, Sister Francetta writes, Catholic missionaries do not leave their posts unless they are notified by the apostolic delegate or their superiors to do so, so we paid no heed to the letters. These are hectic days for us all. Bombers fly over our city daily, and last week over 100 bombs were dropped north of Kaifeng on boats on the Yellow River. Sister Francetta writes that refugee camps are being organized, and the various religious community have been assigned tasks in the camps.
The sisters were also drafted with other missionaries to care for the thousands of wounded Chinese soldiers who were brought through Kaifeng from the front to safety further south.
April 1938. The sisters are helping to treat wounded soldiers at the railway station. We are going around in circles these days so fast that we hardly know what day of the week it is. Since our last letter home, we have been busy doing active relief work. Thousands of wounded soldiers have been brought from the battlefield through Kaifeng. Each trainload brings hundreds of these poor, dear, wounded soldiers. The biggest trainload brought so far at one time had 1,600. Some days there have been as many as 3 loads in one day, so you can imagine what we are living through. The sight of these terribly wounded men is enough to melt one's heart to tears. All one mass of wounds and blood and pus, and the stench of rotting flesh is indescribable. Many soldiers are so badly wounded that they cannot move, and so they are unable to come out onto the platform to have their wounds dressed. So these poor unfortunates are taken care of by the sisters right in the boxcars. Through all their suffering, they are yet mindful of their comrades. One finds a wounded man carrying on his back, from the car to the platform, another with a wounded foot. Sometimes we know ahead of time that a train is due with wounded soldiers, and sometimes we do not receive the notice until the train is in. In the latter case, we simply must stop whatever we are doing and hurry to the station. Sometimes we are just ready to sit down to a meal when the SOS call comes, and then we go without our meal. Sometimes we leave here in the forenoon and do not return until after 9 p.m. Then we hurriedly eat supper, and then we must replenish our supply baskets, cut gauze, cotton, etc., and finally we snatch a little sleep. The sisters are all good scouts, cheerful and glad to do this great work of mercy. Please do not worry about us, dear Mother. We do, of course, take our life into our hands, so to speak, when we go to dress the wounded soldiers during the daytime, for there is always great danger of bombing. Please do not recall us. It would break our hearts to leave our post. Our sisters and hundreds of other priests and religious were imprisoned in concentration camps from 1941 to 1945.
The sisters wrote of establishing their own way of life. They had kept their breviaries and held their community prayers. Prison life was organized by the prisoners themselves, who formed committees in charge of the sick. The education committee soon opened classes for the children and classes in Chinese language for the adults, an orchestra and a choral group. The sisters and priests also took their share of assignments from the labor committee. Food had to be cooked for 2,000 prisoners, and water had to be pumped. The roll call taken just before. We all had to stand in front of our own house. If someone had died during the night or a baby was born, the number given today would not match with the number counted the previous day, and then the camp officer would have to recount. In the meantime, someone, thinking all was finished, had left, and he would now be missing for the second roll call. Then the officer would demand that all in the house and out of it stand in line and be recounted. The annoyances were offset by the joys they had in regular church service, since they had priests and bishops among them.
August 1945, Sister Francetta writes, "Concentration camp days are over, and you cannot adequately understand how our hearts swelled and our throats choked when we sang the Te Deum on hearing that peace had come. 7 of our boys came down in parachutes August 17. Since the coming of Major Nichols, we are free to go about the city. He sent each internee 2 packages of American cigarettes today. We will sell ours and buy food with the money." The sisters were in poor health, and each one required extended medical care. Sister Francetta notes that they have learned that 29 sisters at St. Benedict's died while they were in the concentration camps.
The sisters' homecoming to Kaifeng was full of disappointments. They found the convent and dispensary nearly ruined. They spent weeks in replacing broken windows and doors and fixtures. Despite the fact that their catechetical and dispensary work would again have to be built from the ground up, they started out with all goodwill, while rejoicing at the fact that another missionary, Sister Mariette Pitts, would soon arrive from St. Benedict's. But scarcely had the dispensary reopened when disturbing news reached Kaifeng. Communist hordes, taking advantage of the disorganized state of affairs, were seizing control of certain sections of the country, killing missionaries and burning churches. The Benedictines decided to remain as long as possible with their Chinese converts to help them during this new period of suffering. They had lived through 2 wars and could, with the help of God, weather this one. But they failed to see that the enemy forces they had previously faced had been bound by international law. Their new foes were a law unto themselves. But in December, the communist troop laid siege to the city suddenly and without warning that it was too late to get out. We will have to leave Kaifeng by truck to Shanghai. 3 months later, they were still in Kaifeng when the American Council ordered all American citizens to leave at the earliest possible date. In fact, we will be on the run. We will do our best to stay, for there is so much good to do. 4 days after this letter was written, they did have to run. They all reached Shanghai, where they found temporary employment in the Aurora Girls' High School, conducted by the Religious of the Sacred Heart. Here, in this refuge city, 2 of the sisters asked permission to return to the United States. The others decided to remain in the Orient, for they were informed of an opening in Formosa, Taiwan. By going to Formosa, they would escape the Chinese communists and still remain in the Orient. Sister Wibra Millenheim, who served in China and Taiwan for 30 years, reflected on the faith dimension of her mission experiences in a letter to the community in 1949 as follows.
"A school today does not mean a school tomorrow or next year. A flourishing mission set up today may be a shambles of ruin tomorrow. Missionaries to China, more than to all others, must keep their eyes on the apparent failure of Good Friday, must cling to the hope of Easter beyond, and remember that only God has the true measure of success or failure." In 1949, they went to Formosa, now Taiwan. A year later, when communism became a threat in Formosa, 2 of the sisters, Francetta and Regia, went to Japan and established a new mission in Tokyo. There, they opened a Chinese cooking school that was very successful. They published a book, The Art of Chinese Cooking, which was reprinted more than 20 times. Sister Francetta became very ill in December 1966. She was hospitalized and died on December 27. She had endeared herself to the Japanese people and to American military families stationed in Japan. A medic who took care of her at the hospital during her last days remarked, I'm in love with Sister Francetta. Sister Shan describes some of the people who attended her wake and funeral. There was Dr. Sakai, the Japanese doctor who had been so good to our sisters in concentration camp, and whom the sisters met years later at a reception in Japan. With tears in his eyes, he had approached the sisters to ask whether they knew him, and of course Sister Francetta never forgot a face. Now he, an exemplary Catholic, with a lovely 13-year-old daughter at his side, prayed a long, long time by Sister. There was Orthodox Bishop Vladimir, who with a priest and choir members held a service at Sister's coffin. There were Benedictine and Franciscan priests who prayed parts of the office of the dead. Sister Shan adds that there were Mormons, a wounded Marine in from Vietnam, and the cigarette lady, who runs a little shop near the sisters. There was the chubby little boy from across the street, who with yellow flowers clutched in his hand, came to bow respectfully and look at Sister briefly. He is a little Buddhist boy. There was the family from next door, 4 beautiful girls and their teenage brother, whom Sister had kept her eye on since the mother and then the father had died. They wept as though she too had been their mother. A woman who had been a student in the Benedictine cooking school wrote, Sister Regia was affectionately known as the straight man for Sister Francetta, who entertained as she instructed, with amusing anecdotes as she fried the pork and grated the ginger. They were true missionaries whose love of people was reflected in their everyday example. She was buried in Tokyo. Sister Francetta was buried 8,000 miles from St. Joseph, Minnesota, but not so far from heaven.